看到几个警卫的表情。
过来了，一个警卫过来了。
In 1991, a former prisoner filmed with a hidden camera the camps where he had spent over 19 years. These are the only uncensored images of the Laogai, the Chinese concentration camps.
I refused to work. All these monitors, 10 of them came together. They beat me, they trampled on me, they pierced the skin off my face.
Established by Mao Zedong, this repressive apparatus still exists. Since it was created 80 years ago, at least 50 million people passed through it. 20 million died.
We were thin and hungry. Several people committed suicide.
When we were in re-education through labor, we didn't know when it would end. We were told it will be over when you are properly rehabilitated. But based on what criteria?
Today, the Laogai is at the heart of the system of domination that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party exercise over the country.
Now, everyone is afraid.
But they still refuse to acknowledge its existence.
The chief of police told me not to say anything, and he threatened to come after my family if I did.
So only exiles, refugees thousands of kilometers away from China dare to talk about it. It all began in 1942 in the chaos of the Civil War. The Chinese Communist Party was fighting against both Japan and the Kuomintang nationalists. Mao Zedong, the leader of the Red Army, set up his capital in the northwest of the country, in Yan'an. There he elaborated his plan to seize control of the party and of the entire country. To accomplish this, he would need a period of terror. But first, he had to bring together all the country's vital forces. Attracted by the promise of a socialist wonderland, educated young people, intellectuals, and artists all converged on Yan'an. But they were soon disillusioned and shocked by the privileges of the communist leaders, a long way from the prevailing austerity. Several intellectuals spoke out publicly and claimed the right to criticize the order established by Mao. Among them Ai Qing, one of the most widely read poets of his generation.
My father wrote an article entitled, "Understanding Writers, Respecting Writers." The role of a writer is not only to sing praises, it's also to criticize what is wrong.
Mao distrusted intellectuals and did not tolerate public criticism. To silence them, he drew inspiration from the Stalinist terror of the 1930s. But he invented a more original approach in China. He called it the rectification movement. In May 1942, he summoned 100 of the most prominent writers and artists of Yan'an and demanded them to put themselves at the service of the party. Those who did not obey were labeled counter-revolutionaries and were forced to reform their thought. They would be forced to confess their crimes. Others had to denounce them to avoid being accused themselves.
They all had to write articles to criticize my father and to criticize others. This was the norm, and it went very far. My father was locked up, imprisoned like a real criminal. Every day, he had to write a self-criticism, even if he had nothing to confess.
Self-criticism, Mao's new weapon. It started with an obligation to write a text criticizing your own bourgeois tendencies. Then you had to denounce friends and acquaintances who dared to criticize the party. The rectification movement targeted tens of thousands of intellectuals and leaders suspected of not obeying Mao's rule. Mao appointed a ringleader, Kang Shen, the head of the security services. He codified the forms of torture. The most trivial technique is universal: tied up, suspended, and beaten until unconscious. The victim is then untied and put in front of a sheet of paper, a technique that makes anyone confess to anything. The rectification movement enabled Mao to unleash a vast purge within the party. Forced confessions were used to clean up the party from the top and to eliminate his rivals. Zhou Enlai, who controlled the party organization in the big cities, surrendered unconditionally by writing a 30,000-word self-criticism. In less than 2 years, Mao purged several tens of thousands of party members. In June 1945, the CP Congress recognized his thought as a leading ideology, on a par with Marxism-Leninism. This was unprecedented in the Communist International. It was a total victory for Mao. While the Red Army was gaining ground throughout the country, it had to deal with a huge flow of prisoners, in addition to the thousands of victims of the rectification campaign. They could simply have been killed, but Mao knew he could make use of them by forcing them to work. And even more, the counter-revolutionaries could be forced to reform their thought and become good soldiers for the revolution. The new system of punishment got a name, Laodong Gaizao, abbreviated as Laogai. In English, reform through labor. The first Laogai camp opened in Lingshu in Hebei province in 1946. Shortly afterwards, a giant camp opened in Chadian, where 50,000 prisoners worked day and night.
I was in high school just after the liberation. It used to be said that Mao and the Communist Party were the running dogs of the Soviet Union. The old slogans were "Down with the Communist Party." Now it was "Down with the Kuomintang."
Slogans alone were not enough. The counter-revolutionaries had to be eliminated. Mao put the Yan'an repression machine to work again. He imposed quotas. He claimed that one Chinese in 100 was a counter-revolutionary. So 1 Chinese in 100, or about 5 million people, had to be eliminated.
This is the letter my mother wrote to her 3 children. She described how she felt when my father died. In 1948, he joined the Kuomintang army. A year later, his battalion rebelled in Hubei, and my father became an officer in the People's Liberation Army. In 1950, during the crackdown on counter-revolutionaries, he was labelled a counter-revolutionary and executed.
Like Hu Ping's father, many were executed. Others were sent to Laogai to undergo reform through labour. New camps were built all over the country. Architects of Stalin's gulags provided expertise to their Chinese colleagues. A 1951 internal memo stated, "Laogai is an essential element of the people's democratic dictatorship. It covers labour camps in factories to learn how to work collectively and where political study takes place, agricultural camps to produce food for the prisoners' survival, special camps for important counter-revolutionaries and serious criminals. These camps must apply a stricter regime, camps for minors to separate them from adults and bad influences."
In my family, there were landlords, wealthy peasants, and bourgeois. So the party believed I had a suspicious family background. My father was a teacher. After the communists came to power in 1949, he was sent to Laogai in a remote suburb of Beijing. He was overweight and had never done any physical work. He couldn't stand the harsh conditions and died. So we were labeled a family whose member was eliminated by the party. As children of counter-revolutionaries, we suffered all sorts of discrimination.
The lives of the families of victims were a far cry from what the official propaganda showed. They were outcast, forbidden from outside contacts, they were persecuted at work, their children were blacklisted from school. There are no photos of Mao's Laogai, but on many construction sites the prisoners were mixed with the local workforce. They were the free labour force, used to build the economy in the fledgling Communist Republic. Millions of prisoners worked like slaves during the day and brought back to the camps behind barbed wire every evening. In the countryside, Mao extended the terror by launching the land reform. And the reform began with eliminating the former landlords. In each village, summary trials were staged. Party envoys designated the guilty culprits, who the peasants had to accuse publicly. Four years after Mao had seized power, almost 5% of the country's population had been victims of his terror campaigns. Between 2 and 3 million people died in the countryside, executed, lynched or driven to suicide. In the cities, 2 million were executed and 2.5 million were deported to Laogai.
My father was a cartoonist, and he started to have problems.
12 million people were subject to what was known as placement under control.
Controlled placement was an invention of Mao's, of which he was very proud. What was the point of killing all those people? They could be a useful workforce. It was better to leave them in society, where they would serve as a negative example. It would strengthen people's confidence in the party.
The under control were the people kept at the workplaces, being paid miserable wages and working under the supervision of their colleagues and party officials. "8,000 kilometers away, a sudden death changed the situation. On the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin, the founder of the Gulag, died. The new leadership of the Soviet Party suspended the purges and 3 years later officially denounced the scale of the repressions ordered by Stalin, the result of personality cult. From then on, every self-respecting Communist Party had to de-Stalinize. In Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party overturned the decisions taken 11 years earlier in Yan'an. Mao's thought was no longer the ruling ideology. The personality cult was officially banned. Mao was humiliated, but he did not directly oppose the party's decisions. Instead, he surprised the country with a new campaign.
Mao Zedong said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools contend." This was a way of soliciting criticism from outside the party. He encouraged everyone to criticize the party to improve its functioning.
The Chinese didn't dare to speak. But Mao made it clear that no one would be condemned for his words.
The party imposed meetings to criticize errors. Speech was liberated. The people started to speak up against the omnipotence of party officials, arbitrary arrests, detentions without trial and torture. In this strange atmosphere of free criticism, Ai Weiwei's father took up his pen.
My father wrote a critique. He simply said that in the Communist Party, some people would always be persecutors and others would always be persecuted.
Beijing University was the first to display dazibaos and criticize the party. The walls were covered with dazibaos.
Feng Guojiang displayed his own dazibao to denounce the brutality of the rectification campaigns at the university.
There was a sentence that said, blinding someone with a lamp in the middle of the night to get a forced confession is fascist behavior.
The 100 Flowers campaign allowed the public security to identify the regime's dissidents, and there were many of them. The time came for Mao to launch a new campaign. It would be known as the anti-rightist movement. On the 8th of June 1957, Mao published an editorial on the front page of the People's Daily. He wrote that under the pretext of helping the Communist Party to rectify itself, a minority of rightists were defying the party and the working class. It opened the hunt of those accused of being rightist. The ritual was still the same. Every rightist identified was forced to engage in a public self-criticism.
They wanted me to take the floor to criticize myself. There was a huge crowd. All the party committee members were present to make me confess my crime. They wanted me to say that I was against the party and socialism. I dared to speak up. And I said that first of all I had to set the record straight. All the people stood up and shouted, You are not allowed to say anything. You are only allowed to confess your crime. You are only allowed to admit your anti-party and anti-socialist statements. I was called the most rightist student in Tsinghua University.
Each work unit in the country was given a quota of rightists to denounce. If they didn't meet their targets, they would have to invent culprits.
Then they organised a meeting to examine me and unmask a new rightist. At the time, I was in charge of teaching mathematics in a middle school in Anyang. I was accused of having said in front of 10 party members, "We must decapitate the communists." It was a ridiculous accusation.
In 1 year, more than 500,000 rightists were arrested. At public sessions, family members were forced to denounce them. To simplify the detention procedure, the party used a form of repression parallel to the Laogai, Laojiao, re-education through labour. Everything was streamlined. There was no need for a trial. A simple administrative decision was enough. There was no time limit on incarceration.
We were settled in Beijing in a Laojiao center. It was in Yonghegong, the biggest Lamaic temple in Beijing. Today it's a tourist site. There were about 300 of us, and we made canvas shoes. We sewed the soles. Everyone sat on small stools. We were side by side like slaves. We worked all day, from morning to evening without stopping. The people outside didn't know anything, because the newspapers didn't give that kind of information.
Mao said that rightists shouldn't be allowed to stay in the cities. They should be sent to remote areas. My father was placed all by himself in forestry farm number 8520. He had to go to the forest to cut wood.
Like Ai Weiwei's father, many rightists were deported to the forests of Manchuria, China's Siberia. 10 years after Mao took power, China had hundreds of camps, farms, factories and construction sites. Spread throughout the country, they formed the so-called Chinese concentration camp archipelago.
We were put on trains. But they didn't tell us where they were sending us. During the journey, we weren't allowed to raise our heads. Everyone had to keep their heads down. So we didn't know where we were going. We arrived at a station called Chadian, a very small station. Next to it was the Qinghe Labor Reform Farm. But it wasn't a farm at all. It was a concentration camp. There were ditches, very high walls with electrified wire and searchlights. The sentries had guns, machine guns. There were already prisoners inside. When we arrived, they said to us, "You're lucky. You have buildings to live in." It was us who had to build them. Because when they arrived, there was nothing. It was just a bunch of reeds. Reeds.
At first, I was lying to myself. I thought we would stay there for 3 to 5 months and then we would be released. But then the government announced that the Laogai could be unlimited, that the detention would only end once the re-education was complete. And if it wasn't, you could stay there for life. We got up before dawn and worked all day until sunset. There was a river called the Xiao River. We pulled carts with big wheels for about 3 to 4 kilometers. And we collected silt on the banks of the Xiao River. It was unbearable. The yoke with the buckets full of silt ended up being terribly heavy on our shoulders. When we lifted our yoke, we winced with pain and squinted. We looked like clowns. It was exhausting. We were skinny and hungry. Every evening after work, we had to undergo an evaluation. How did we behave at work during the day? Did we still have things to improve? Did we recognize our crimes and reactionary thoughts? At the time, the expression "sabotage the work" was widely used. You were told, "You are sabotaging the work. You are resisting reform." The members of your group would surround you to criticize you. The leaders would attend the session to check. Everyone wanted to show their enthusiasm because it was important for political rehabilitation and for the way we were treated. When the members of your group hit you, they went at it with all their might. Those sessions were atrocious. After these beatings, many people hanged themselves. Others electrocuted themselves or jumped into the river.
When Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, the worst was yet to come. It was his most extreme project. He ordered the mobilization of the entire society so that the Chinese economy would surpass that of developed countries. Prisoners were the first to be requisitioned.
It was 1959, during the Great Leap Forward. The working days were very long. We weren't even allowed to go back to the barracks to eat. We ate on the ground. In winter, when the meal arrived, the soup was cold. It had frozen.
In the countryside, everybody was ordered to help build roads, blast furnaces, and other industrial projects. There was no one left to harvest the crops which were left to rot. Famine set in throughout the country. The Laogai was its first victim.
During the Great Famine, we ate wild grass seeds. They were like cereals. The problem was there wasn't enough of it. So many people died of hunger, of exhaustion. Every 2 or 3 days, someone died of hunger or exhaustion.
The mortality rate in the Laogai often exceeded 50%. Several camps had to be closed because everyone had died of hunger. Cannibalism spread. The dead were thrown into mass graves or simply left in the fields.
It was almost impossible to escape. Where could you go? We couldn't go home. Our families would have reported us immediately. We couldn't contact friends either, because no friend would shelter a criminal. If you sheltered a criminal, you became one yourself.
It was impossible to escape the total surveillance established by the state. Everyone was watching everyone, in the street, at work, and even at home.
At the time, apartments were too small and overcrowded. People could hear everything that was going on next door. For example, if someone listened to an enemy radio station like Voice of America, the neighbors could report them to the police.
In any case, the police were aware of everything that was going on. They relied on neighborhood committees that monitored the private lives of every citizen and on work units that monitored their professional and social lives. Every Chinese citizen was made to carry a hukou booklet, a passport on which the residence permit, social background and family situation was recorded. The police were able to check them at any time.
They would come banging on the door in the middle of the night, shouting, "Hukou control!" So we would get up immediately and my mother would go and fetch the hukou booklet. They would shout, "When we knock on the door, you must open it immediately, not go and get the booklet."
Citizens' lives depended on the hukou. Without it, you couldn't get ration coupons, work or housing. And the prisoners in the Laogai no longer had their hukou.
We had no ration coupons, no papers, because they had all been confiscated. But I decided to escape from the camp, even if it meant dying. One day, at about 2 a.m., I got up. And I crossed the barbed wire. Without being electrocuted. I don't know how it happened. Was there a power cut? Or had I not touched the wire? I arrived in Tianjin. Of course, I was hungry. As I had some money, I went into a restaurant. In the room there was a mirror. I looked in it and didn't recognize myself. My face was puffy, yellow and black. I no longer looked like a human being, but like a ghost. I slept in empty lots for about 10 days. As I had no ID, I couldn't find accommodation, even in a small hotel. I discussed this with a friend. He turned me in. He betrayed me. My friend Hu told the police everything. I was arrested. This is the judgment that condemned me to life imprisonment.
Though Mao succeeded in installing his system of total control, everything else collapsed. In less than 4 years, the Great Leap Forward had brought the country to the brink of bankruptcy and had caused between 35 and 40 million deaths. It was urgent to end it. In January 1961, at the conference of 7,000 cadres, the chairman of the Republic, Liu Shaoqi, stated that human error was responsible for 70% of the famine. He took aim at Mao himself. Mao had to make a self-criticism. He remained party chairman, but Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping took over the day-to-day leadership. They put aside the hunt for counter-revolutionaries. The economy had to be revived, and the Laogai experienced its first wave of liberations.
They released me on the 1st of July 1962. But after I got out, I was a rightist under supervision. So I was still working in the countryside, but under surveillance. I did what the peasants didn't want to do. As they were not educated people, they didn't know all that. Fortunately, I stayed in the countryside, because in the city, as a rightist and a former prisoner, I would have been in a lot of trouble. My wife was still a teacher in town. Our daughter was very young. She was born in 1958.
It would take a long time for the economy to recover. In the meantime, the population was given promises. Several tens of thousands of party cadres was sent to the Laogai for overzealousness. Mao was isolated as never before. It would take him 4 years to prepare his revenge, and once again, it would involve a new wave of terror. Mao began by printing a collection of quotations from his speeches and writings, the famous Little Red Book. Every young person, whether a high school or university student, received a copy. Our state is a people's dictatorship. Its first function is to repress the classes and reactionary elements within the country.
At the time, one idea kept coming back to me, although I didn't really dare think about it. I had a vague feeling that this was a new Mao campaign. This book was a very powerful weapon at that time.
In Tiananmen, I saw our great leader, Chairman Mao. Of course, I was very happy and excited. I'd been educated by the party for so many years. I felt that a great revolution was coming. We were going to transform not only China, but the whole world.
In Tiananmen Square, Mao's loyal servant, Zhao Enlai, reformed 24 years earlier in Yan'an, was in charge of declaring the war. The personality cult, abandoned 10 years earlier, was back. The Cultural Revolution was underway. All high school and university students, as well as young workers, were organized into paramilitary units, the Red Guards.
No one could escape it. If you didn't participate, you weren't a true supporter of Chairman Mao.
At the time, all the classes were suspended. The revolution meant taking to the streets. We told people to sing revolutionary songs and shout slogans.
Mao didn't give any limits to the Red Guards' power. He placed them above the forces of law and order.
Churches, temples, and cultural places, especially libraries, were to be destroyed.
The Red Guards attacked those they accused of being the proponents of bourgeois culture, such as writers and artists, teachers, engineers, and so on.
First, we went to the Public Security Office where we were given the information. Then we would find the suspects and search their homes.
Victims of the Red Guards were rarely sent to prison or to the camps. They were instead detained in their workplaces. They were accused of being counter-revolutionaries. Surrounded by fanatical Red Guards, they were obliged to write self-criticisms.
Our work unit was next to the river, and we could clearly hear the groans of people being hit. As a Chinese proverb says, it sounded like the cries of ghosts and wolves.
For Mao, the aim of the campaign was to get rid of his opponents within the party. Not even the highest officials, members of the Central Committee, the Politburo, or the government were spared. They would all end up facing the mob. Deng Xiaoping escaped the worst. He was sent to a tractor factory hundreds of kilometers from Beijing, where he worked as a simple assembly line worker under supervision. Liu Shaoqi, the chairman of the Republic, was arrested inside the Forbidden City and tortured for weeks by his own subordinates. He died of his injuries in prison at the end of 1969.
Even if you were an old revolutionary, a civil war fighter, one sentence was enough to make you lose your status. That's what happened to Xi Jinping's father.
The family of China's future #1 did not escape the Red Guards. His own father was persecuted, and his mother forced to publicly denounce him. One of his sisters committed suicide. Xi Jinping, then aged 15, was labeled as the son of an enemy of the people. He was deported to the countryside. He stayed there for 7 years. Two years after it was launched, the Cultural Revolution had fallen into absolute chaos. Mao had managed to get rid of his opponents, but now nobody was in control of the situation in the country anymore. The Red Guards split up and ended up killing each other. Mao had only one way to regain control: to call in the army.
The army and the propaganda team created totally closed study classes. There were always soldiers next to us to monitor us. They were supposed to help us study Mao's thought.
My detention started in August. They locked me in an office in my factory. That's where they interrogated us. They made us stand in the airplane position, and they hit us in the neck like this.
In Guangxi, the army committed real massacres. Why did the army kill? Because Mao gave the order. We heard gunshots everywhere. We often heard that this or that friend had been killed. Many people were massacred.
The takeover was violent. In Guangxi province alone, more than 100,000 people died in a few months.
Mao used us, the Red Guards. But at a certain point, we were no longer of any use to him. So after having taken advantage of us, he threw us out with a big blow and sent us all to the countryside.
Hundreds of thousands of Red Guards were arrested. The Laogai camps were overflowing. Mao decided to send all urban youth into exile in the countryside. 17 million young people were rusticated.
I was sent for a year and a half to a Liberation Army farm for re-education, like all students in Beijing universities. We formed a company re-educated on the spot. Every day we farmed rice. We raised pigs and did military exercises in the middle of the night or during meals. Otherwise, we studied Mao's theory. We denounced one another and criticized our selfishness.
We'd always been told that socialism was good and that the Chinese system was the best in the world. But in the countryside, we saw the poverty of the peasants. We had no idea that it would challenge our worldview so much.
Young people met deportees from previous waves of terror.
When we got there, some people had committed suicide. Others had died of hunger or disease. In the village, 9 people lived under surveillance. One of them was an old man who wanted to talk but was unable to, because for a long time no one had spoken to him. He'd always been locked up alone. At the end of his life, he was very thin, as if he had dried up. He looked like a Jewish prisoner in the German concentration camps.
Tens of millions of city dwellers were forcibly moved to the countryside. Hundreds of millions of peasants were monitoring them. Rural China had become a huge forced labor camp. Mao had achieved his goals. In April 1969, 3 years after launching the Cultural Revolution, he was finally able to convene a party congress.
我们的大会，这一次第9次代表大会能够开得好，能够开展一个团结的大会，胜利的大会。在这一块，期待更大的胜利。
Mao confirmed that the army would continue to play a leading role. Marshal Lin Biao was even designated as his successor. But the most radical supporters of the Red Guards refused to accept the preeminence of the military. So in early 1970, Mao launched the bloodiest campaign of the Cultural Revolution. A new cycle of mass executions began, and this time it was meant to be spectacular. It started in Beijing's largest stadium in front of 100,000 people. The purges immediately spread all over the country. A few months later, at the Party Central Committee meeting, the extent of the top-level crackdown became obvious. Only a few people took their seats beside Mao. Lin Biao, his Minister of Defense, who was soon to die in circumstances that have never been clarified, his eternal Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai, and Keng Sheng, the head of the political police, one of the founders of the Laogai. Seven years after the start of the Cultural Revolution, the new Beijing subway was the only sign of progress. Once again, China had been stunted. The national economy was in a deep recession. The very survival of the country was at stake. In order to revive it, many party cadres were reinstated. Deng Xiaoping returned from exile and appeared alongside Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and the Prime Minister, Zhou Enlai. In January 1975, some stability at the top allowed Zhou Enlai to consider rebuilding the economy. He launched the 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, defense and technology. The Chinese regained hope. And what if modernization finally changed the country? But once again, hope was dashed when Zhou Enlai died of cancer in January 1976. It was a major blow. Many people in China feared that after the death of Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping would be unable to complete the reforms.
I just entered my second year at Beijing No. 11 High School. On the Day of the Dead, we pay tribute to Zhou Enlai. We used the day to commemorate his memory. From April the 1st to April the 5th, I attended all the rallies.
On April the 5th, tens of thousands of people converged in Tiananmen Square to lay wreaths at the foot of the Monument to People's Heroes in memory of Zhou Enlai.
It wasn't organized. It was spontaneous. I was there on April the 5th. I think it was a Monday. I took the number 5 bus. Through the window, I saw that there were a lot of people in Tiananmen Square. So I got off right away at Tiananmen Station.
Within a few hours, the funeral tributes turned into a demonstration against Mao. Posters were put up denouncing the government or demanding the continuation of the four modernizations. Despite 27 years of terror and brainwashing, the people of Beijing were rising up.
I took 2 classes of high school students to Tiananmen Square. Once there, I displayed 4 poems.
I was in front of the palace of the National People's Congress with the crowd. We wanted to enter, but people were being arrested and taken inside. At that moment, I was very scared. The crowd finally began to disperse in the afternoon.
The day after April the 5th, everything was back to normal. The first popular uprising in Tiananmen Square had lasted only a few days.
I was arrested on April the 16th. The interrogation took place during the night. They came for me and made a hell of a racket. We called them night interrogations. It meant that the crime was serious. They threw a bunch of documents on the desk saying, "You're accused of being a counter-revolutionary."
Tens of thousands of arrests. Everything was in place for a new great purge. But no orders came.
高山在痛哭，大海泪涛涌，惊天动地的噩耗啊，震撼全球。我国各族人民敬爱的伟大领袖毛泽东同志于1976年9月9日在北京逝世。
Maybe some people cried. Maybe the few peasants who benefited from the redistribution of land. But as a group, the peasants hated Mao. Mao was 40 years older than me, so I told myself that I couldn't die before him. I had to take care of myself to outlive him. All my hopes for change rested on what would happen after his death.
Mao's death came just in time. Maybe we still had a chance to be saved, because we knew that after his death, China would experience a major transformation.